Unit 1, Presentation 3, The Philosophy of Parole. This is the second of the presentations which cover the many facets of parole. This one, on philosophy, follows on from the presentation on the history of parole. Recall from that presentation that Alexander McConaughey, the so-called father of parole, was driven to develop his mark system, a precursor to modern-day parole, because he considered that attempts at simultaneously meting out retribution and rehabilitating people simply didn't work well. Let us look for a minute at retribution and rehabilitation as they sit more generally within the philosophy of punishment. Punishment theory is the branch of philosophy concerned with punishment. Traditionally, there are 4 justifications or aims put forward for punishment. By aims, I mean goals in terms of what we are seeking to achieve when we punish someone. By justifications, I mean something deeper. Punishment is, by definition, harsh treatment. If the state is going to mete out harsh treatment on behalf of us all, we have to be very clear on what basis we both claim and exercise that power. Perhaps the most ancient justification for punishment is retribution, often referred to as a person getting their just deserts. The idea is that the offender is at an advantage over the victim and society, and in order to correct that imbalance, he must be punished. Retributive theories of punishment can be found in ancient texts, perhaps the most well-known being the injunction in the book of Leviticus to take an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It sounds harsh to modern ears, but it actually represented society becoming more civilized, because the point was that an eye, but no more than an eye, could justifiably be taken. In that sense, the concept that punishment ought to be proportionate to the crime was written into the law. The retributive instinct is clearly ancient and it runs psychologically deep. Therefore, any proposal that we should simply do away with punishment altogether must account for it. How would such a proposal ensure that society maintains the rule of law and does not regress to times when crimes were avenged personally, and therefore there was always a risk of blood feuds developing and of excessive and escalating responses to wrongs? The second traditional aim or justification for punishment is rehabilitation. That is, the idea that the offender will be reformed or rehabilitated through punishment. Rehabilitation, in many ways, underpins the institution of parole, through the idea that a person can make moral and practical progress as a consequence of being punished. However, rehabilitation is not without challenge as a justification for punishment. A retributive theory of punishment would hold that while the state can punish someone to reset the balance, that is, to give them their just deserts, to go further than that and to claim a prerogative to fix them or rehabilitate them is to claim too much sovereignty over them. German philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that it is not permissible to use the process of punishment for any purpose other than to simply correct the imbalance created by the crime. In his Metaphysics of Morals, he said, "Judicial punishment can never be used merely as a means to promote some other good for the criminal himself or for civil society, but instead it must in all cases be imposed on him only on the grounds that he has committed a crime." Kant is famous for arguing more generally that a human being should never be used as a means to an end. For example, they shouldn't be punished in order to send a message to someone else. That would be to use them as a tool to achieve some particular goal or end. Human beings, Kant argued, are ends in and of themselves, not means to some other ends being achieved. For this reason, a purely retributive theory of punishment would also rule out incapacitation as a justification for punishment. That is, justifying punishment by reference to future crimes which are thereby avoided. So too, deterrence as a justification would be ruled out. That is, justifying punishment by reference to the offender or other people being deterred from future offending. Looking at the history of incarceration in America, there has always been a lack of clarity about what the philosophical underpinnings are. In the early days, the goals were lofty indeed. The religious folk involved in the development of prisons saw them as places where not only bodies could be rehabilitated, but souls could be saved. They believed the strict conditions of silence and solitary confinement would be conducive to profound religious experience. It turns out enforced isolation is more likely to result in psychological breakdown, though. Those early models were expensive and rather impractical and gave way to a more mercenary approach of exploiting the labour of prisoners to cover the cost of incarcerating them and even perhaps to turn a profit. Thoughts of rehabilitation fell by the wayside at that point. After the Second World War, though, rehabilitation really got a boost with the emergence of the medical model of incarceration, which came out of California. Inmates were now patients to be treated. Any time an institution has the word correctional in its name, it is a nod towards rehabilitation as the aim and justification for punishment. Such institutions don't necessarily live up to their name, though. One of the drivers of the prison riots in the 1970s was the fact that in so-called correctional institutions, people were locked in cells for hours and hours on end without access to the kind of programming and opportunities which would merit the claim that they were being corrected. This era led to skepticism that rehabilitation was possible in a prison environment, and the pendulum swung back towards a more retributive just desserts model. What we are left with is a mixed situation. There are 34 states out of 50 which have retained their parole systems and which, to varying degrees, admit of the possibility of early release based on the person's progress and achievements. A lack of clarity about our goals with incarceration remains, though. Brenda Shell, a former warden of the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women, was on The Larry King Show in 2005. She made a comment which highlights exactly the way in which the contradiction between meting out harsh punishment and correcting people pertains in society. She said, "I think that it's an awesome responsibility that's placed on me to manage this institution, because we're responsible for transforming women's lives. Public safety in the community is dependent upon us properly preparing these women to go home and to be mothers to their children. Also, we have challenges as far as society's viewpoint as to how you manage correctional facilities. A lot of people want people to suffer when they come into correctional institutions." Notwithstanding the fact that Alexander McConaughey, the father of parole, insisted on distinguishing between a phase of a sentence which is backward-looking and retributive and a phase of a sentence which is forward-looking and focused on rehabilitation, the two things are not separated out in the framework of parole in Maryland. Of the 20 factors which the Parole Commission considers when deciding whether to grant parole, the first on the list is explicitly about retribution. It is the circumstances surrounding the crime. The second is rather more cryptic. It is the physical, mental, and moral qualifications of persons who become eligible for parole. Others are explicitly about rehabilitation, such as the defender's behaviour and adjustment and the offender's participation in institutional and self-help programs. It follows that when a person goes out for a parole hearing, it is not possible to predict whether the final decision will be backwards-looking, that is focused on making sure they get their just desserts, or forward-looking, that is merciful. Academics from the University of Minnesota and from the University of Stanford put together a 10-point plan for improving parole decision-making in America. One of the things they argue for is that parole decision-making should be forward-looking only. To allow for it to be backward-looking is, essentially, to permit parole boards to go back over the judge's sentencing decision. They argue there should be a meaningful presumption of release at first eligibility so that the majority of prisoners are released at that time. Parole boards should not be authorized to deny release on the ground that the prisoner has not served sufficient time for punishment purposes. And they also state, rather than relitigate the sentencing judge's decision concerning proportionate punishment, the board should ask whether a prison stay beyond the date of first release eligibility is necessary to serve the goal of public protection. If that proposal were implemented, it would be consistent with the history of the institution of parole. It would represent a commitment on the part of society towards a system which is merciful, and it would avoid creating a sense of frustration for those who do their level best under the difficult condition of being incarcerated to move forward with positivity. I want to read here an excerpt of a letter which was received at Second Chance for Women, the precursor to Prepare, which illustrates the point well. I already went up for parole and was denied. No one cared about the time I've completed infraction-free for a decade, merit pod inmate for 5 years, and in Rescue Cat Association, earned my diploma, and worked and completed all mandatory groups that are offered here. Mr. X and peers in authority felt the charges were horrendous, and I have no respect for human life. No one is dead. I had no knowledge that we'd be attacked, nor did I physically hurt anyone. They didn't care about my 2 daughters or family who've been doing the time with me. I see now no one really cares at the prison or at the parole board. Note 2 things here. 1, she is disputing their analysis of and grasp of the facts of the crime. But unlike at the trial stage, she is in no position to challenge that. 2, the response she got will become known by others who will question whether it is worth working hard to move forward with positivity. That outcome is in absolutely no one's interests. For those facing parole hearings, 3 points to take away are as follows. 1, outcomes of parole hearings are unpredictable because the process is both forward-looking and backward-looking. 2, the past is out of your control, but the present and the future are not. 3, it is not obvious that there is a better option than moving forward with positivity, despite the inadequacies of the system.